Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today we are going to be talking about the second full-length album from Air, 10,000 Hertz Legend. I remember such a long time ago when I first heard this album in its entirety, and having a lot of mixed feelings on it. There were some tracks I liked, some I didn't, and overall I felt awfully disturbed by the album as a whole. From what I can tell, this seems to have been the case for many other critics, as it got somewhat mixed reviews back when it came out in 2001. I think it's pretty fair to say most people didn't see this coming. It was kinda hinted at in the version Suicides. Forgot to show this CD off last time, by the way. What with its spookier and more Pink Floyd-esque tones, but it felt like Air was going out of their way to make an album that was pretty much the exact opposite of Moon Safari. The weirdest thing about this album, though, is that while I first heard it back in middle school, I just thought it was alright overall. About 2 years ago, I'm gonna say, it just suddenly clicked. I started to notice things about the album that never even occurred to me before, started to love songs I previously skipped over, and now I think the album is just as good, if not better, than Moon Safari. Of course, it's brilliant in completely different ways from Moon Safari, but in the past couple of years, this album shot so far up my favorites of all time list like you wouldn't even believe. Now, as I've mentioned, this album is almost the exact opposite of Moon Safari. While that album was almost universally accessible, easy to get into, and extremely nostalgic, this album goes out of its way to be dark and disturbing. There's still a lot of love and emotion poured into the album, but those emotions are significantly more negative. I guess I'll go down track by track, since there's a lot to say about every individual song. It starts out with electronic performers, which sets the tone of the album and sounds downright inhuman. The drums are off-kilter but mechanical. The guitars are distorted, and the radioactivity-style choirs we heard on version Suicides return. Then some weird voice that sounds like an electronic walrus or something comes in, along with another mechanical beat or metronome, and then some drunk-sounding vocoders start rambling over some pianos, etc. It's a very strange-sounding track, not to mention intentionally unpleasant and inhuman. Then we move on to How Does It Make You Feel, which is at least a little warmer, with more typical Air-style laid-back guitars and simple drums, along with a computer-generated voice expressing its love for another computer-generated voice.
Well, I really think you should quit smoking.
But then these ethereal-sounding choirs fade in, and it breaks into a huge-sounding and almost but not quite orchestral chorus, repeatedly saying the title. While it is one of the warmer-sounding tracks on this album, as a kid, it totally creeped me out. First of all, it's in a minor key, so there's only so much comfort it can offer. And on top of that, the actual human singing on it is handled by Roger Joseph Manning Jr., who quite certainly does not sound like the vocoders on Moon Safari, or for that matter, like the thick-accented Jean-Benoit Dunkel especially on later albums like Talkie Walkie. Both of these facts created an atmosphere that felt a lot spookier than I expected. It had me thinking at the time, this kind sounds like Air, but at the same time, it does not sound like the Air I'm used to, and that makes me feel uncomfortable. That sense of creepy unfamiliarity continued on to the next track, Radio Number 1, which once again brings in Manning Jr. on vocals, along with Jason Faulkner and Ken Andrews as well. They're in a lot of different tracks. This song is super bombastic and intense, and sounds like some kind of advertisement from hell. The chorus sounds like the really big, like, the generic singers you'd hear on a random ad, like The Whole Town Is Talking About the Web Boys. The verse in the middle sounds ghostly and somewhat out of place, and the outro sounds like a DJ humming over the end of the song playing on the radio, except it's not the end of the song. It instead ends with just the drums and a lot of repeat cymbal crashes. Well, I guess the song is poppier and cheerier than some of the others on here. Like How Does It Make You Feel, there is definitely an underlying creepiness to this song. Like, as I listened to it more than more, it grew on me, and it's pretty fun to sing along with. But when I first heard it, I had no idea what the hell I was listening to. There were so many WTF moments on this album on first listen, especially since I was already familiar with their style on other albums like Moon Safari and Talkie-Walkie, and I could recognize how different everything sounded. For instance, the next track, The Vagabond, starts out with a harmonica and is sung by Beck, who goes on a tirade of screaming falsetto at the end. I think songs like this are why I found more recent songs featuring Beck like Time Wind by M83 and Tiny Cities by Flume to be mostly disappointing. The guy has such a distinctive voice on this album that just overflows with personality. And while the song would probably not be nearly as memorable if it were given to a different singer, it's still a fun and pretty catchy rock song with Air's weird electronic effects thrown all over the place. Actually, this is one of the least creepy songs on here in retrospect. But the fact remains, nothing on any of Air's albums sounds remotely like this. The next song, Radian, is a little more characteristic of Air, though it doesn't start out that way. It starts out with some little wavering synth a la Jean-Michel Jarre, and then goes into this deep and brooding synth pad and some pitched down vocals from Barbara Cohen, and later some subtle tribal percussion as well. But then some harps come in, and then it turns into a more typical Premier Symptomes style track with lots of flutes on top. The outro is kinda weird too, though, with these odd wavering pianos. But this is probably the closest thing we got to a track that was like of the Premier Symptomes mold, so for that I have to give it credit. It's one of my favorites. Then we move on to Lucky and Unhappy, which I actually heard out of context from my uncle quite a bit before hearing the album proper. It's got this huge synth bass, usual acoustic guitar, and some synth orchestra in some parts. The vocals are also pretty creepy, but in a much more obvious way than How Does It Make You Feel or Radio Number 1. It is pretty catchy, though admittedly it's not a huge standout. If I hadn't heard it out of context such a long time before, I don't think it would be quite as special to me. Then there's Sex-Born Poison. As a kid, I probably should have suspected something was up with this one, given the title. But when I first heard it, it scared the crap out of me, and I was afraid to return to it. All the subtle creepiness from earlier on in the album climaxes here in this song that's no longer just subtly creepy. It starts out with an acoustic guitar in a minor key, with these weird, spooky, ghostly vibraphone sounds, along with some vocals which may or may not be talking about suicide. Lovely. And then later drops into these intensely creepy synths with Japanese vocals from Shugen Yoshinaga of Buffalo Daughter, probably talking about sex. At the end of her verse, the song basically starts over. The acoustic guitar from earlier comes back, but it is instead accompanied by an orchestra and a more 60s-ish guitar. And in the second Buffalo Daughter verse, which I believe to be the same as the first and translated into English, we get all these weird electronic percussion noises that sound like they came from an Atari machine. And at the end, it all culminates with the orchestra coming back in and almost reaching 2 steps from hell level intensity. Nowadays, I think this song is a freaking masterpiece. I love it. Though, I think it should be fairly obvious why the middle schooler me was so deeply disturbed by this song in particular. At the very least, I wasn't traumatized by it, because this song was immediately counteracted by the catchier and poppier People in the City. This song still has that subtle feeling of dread that the rest of the album has, thanks to being mostly in minor keys, but it is at least more fun. There's some jazzy piano noises, tense electronic basses, city sound effects imitated by synthesizers, and some catchy, albeit inhuman, vocoder vocals. P-E-O-P-L-E-C-I-T-Y, people in the city. Of course, then we get Wonder Milky Bitch, probably the single strangest song on the whole album. For the longest time, this song was my least favorite, mainly due to the lyrics, which have Air repeatedly swearing, although Jean-Benoit Dunkel's thick accent makes the word bitch sound more like beach. And later figuring out that the song was about getting a blowjob didn't exactly help either. But instrumentally, it's grown on me a lot. The boinging sounds at the beginning, the awkward silences, the vintage pianos and orchestras, the uncredited deep voice, who I believe to be Justin Mildell Johnson, same guy who does the humming at the end of Radio Number 1. And then the weirdly beautiful outro with Dunkel's typically lovely singing / swearing. The lyrics makes this song much more uncomfortable than it would be otherwise. As a kid, it made me want to go, I need an adult. And as a high schooler, it continued to bother me. It felt out of place. But nowadays, I see all that discomfort as the entire point, planned out by Air from the very beginning. It's another song that I realized was being enhanced by the unusual for Air sounds of the earlier songs on the album. I was already creeped out and unsettled by those songs, but just as Sex-Born Poison went over the top in its creepiness and nearly traumatized me as a kid, Wonder Milky Bitch overachieved in its feelings and discomfort and made me feel dirty anytime I listened to it. Even now, I probably would not be playing this song out in the open for all to hear, but knowing that I was, set up to feel uncomfortable from the start, and also the fact that I'm now 20 years old, allows me to listen to it more easily. Thankfully, next up is the wonderfully weird and epic single, Don't Be Light. It starts out with the boinging for a few seconds. Then after some processed voices saying the title, Don't Be Light, suddenly breaks out into a huge orchestra with a soprano singer, and it keeps changing up and moving at top speed after that, bringing guitars, electric pianos, whistling in the outro. And yes, even Beck comes back to spout some philosophical gibberish. The orchestras in particular make this song really stand out, from the epic intro to one part in the middle where they screech like a horror movie soundtrack. This song was actually the first one I ever heard from this album, and I was in love with it immediately, and still stands as an easy favorite from this album to this day. The album could just end here if it wanted to, but then that would be a satisfying and traditionally pleasing ending, and given the atmosphere of this album, we wouldn't want that now, would we? Instead, it ends with Carmel Prisoner, an ambient instrumental with a dark synth pad, a chorus of sad vocals going electronic beeping, acoustic guitar, and an outro that sounds like a loud highway circling around your head and getting distorted into oblivion. There we go, much more fittingly ambiguous way to end the album. So, overall, I think it's pretty clear why this album has grown on me so much over the years. Everything about this album seems to be meant to screw with the heads of any longtime Air fans. As a kid, I was creeped out by a lot of it, and thought they had gone off the deep end. But now I can see it was all intentional. It was basically meant to challenge fans of Moon Safari. They asked the listener, how does it make you feel? And I can definitively say, it makes me feel highly impressed. Definitely go check it out. Just maybe don't expect it to hit you right away. It took me about 5 years to really fully click with me, so hopefully this review speeds up the process for you. But as for me, this has grown to become one of my all-time favorite albums, right up to the same level as Moon Safari. I'm overall feeling a 9.5 out of 10. Favorite tracks: How Does It Make You Feel, The Vagabond, Radian, Sex-Born Poison, People in the City, Don't Be Light, and Carmel Prisoner. Least favorite track, if I had to pick, gonna be totally honest, I think it might be Electronic Performers. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.